Della Marsh read the notice nailed to her own gatepost by lantern light, and she did not cry. It was a sheriff's sale notice, tacked to the gate of the farm her husband died owning. $960, it said. Owed, past due. And inside the house, asleep and warm under a quilt she'd stitched by hand, her boy did not know yet. The note had been bundled into a war bond drive and assigned. That's the part that stings. A stranger held the paper on her land now. And Harlan Cruz, the county speculator, tipped his hat to her at the feed store in front of half the men in Halloran, Kansas, and said it plain. A widow's got no business fighting a plow and a mortgage both, Mrs. Marsh. Then a soldier stepped down off the Tuesday bus, a duffel on his shoulder, a folded assignment paper with her name on it, something of Tom's in his breast pocket. He asked the way to the Marsh place. He said he'd come to collect. If you believe love is built with two pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. It was autumn of 1945. The war was over across the water, but it was not over in that farmhouse. It's never over when the man doesn't come home. Della Marsh worked the quarter section alone. Had done since the telegram came. Italy, it said. The spring of '44. They don't write much on a telegram. They don't have to. She'd read it standing in the same doorway where she stood now, and she had folded it 4 times and put it in the drawer with the good tablecloth, and she had gone out to milk the cow because the cow did not care about telegrams and the cow had to be milked. That was the shape of her grief. Chores, one after the next. You get up. You feed the stock. You bank the fire. You do the thing in front of you, because the thing in front of you is the only mercy left. She was 33 years old. Dark hair parted down the center and twisted back off her neck. Green eyes deep as pond water. A mouth that dimpled even when it was set hard, which was most of the time now, and her hands. Lord, her hands. They'd gone to leather. Cracked at the knuckle. Strong as a man's and twice as tired. The farm was one bad season deep. That's a phrase you might not know if you've never worked ground. It means the margin's gone. It means last year's trouble ate this year's cushion, and if the wheat comes in short or the hail comes in early, there's nothing underneath you but the dirt itself. She managed. She was proud of managing. Too proud, maybe. That was the crack in her, if you want to know it early. Della Marsh could not tell the difference between a kindness and a pity. To her they wore the same coat. And so she armored herself against both, and in doing that she armored herself against the very thing that might have saved her. But I'm getting ahead. Let me show you the woman before I show you the trouble. Come morning, she'd carry a basket of eggs the 2 miles into town, and she'd trade them at the mercantile, not for coffee, not for cloth, but for her boys' school books. A speller and a reader and a thin arithmetic. Weber Marsh was 8 years old. Everybody called him Webb. He had his father's ears and his mother's stubborn chin. And he was going to have his letters and his sums if it took every egg that henhouse could lay. She had decided that. A widow can decide a thing very hard when she's got nothing else to hold. The gate hung crooked. Had done for a year. The hinge Tom meant to fix the week he shipped out. Della splinted it herself with a length of oak and a wrap of baling wire, and it held more or less. If you lifted it as you swung it. Everybody in the county knew to lift that gate. It was a small thing. But a farm is nothing but 1,000 small things, and when the man goes, the small things start to come undone one at a time, and you cannot fix them fast enough, and that is how a place dies. Not all at once. Slow, a latch. A shingle. A fence wire. A season. At supper she set 3 plates. 2 she filled. The 3rd she left empty. Tom's chair at the head of the table, and Tom's plate in front of it, clean and white and untouched. Webb never asked about it anymore. He'd asked once, that first winter, and she'd told him, "We keep your daddy's place. And the boy had nodded the way children do when they decide to be brave for their mother's sake. So the empty chair stayed. It was the closest thing to a headstone she had, since Tom was buried in Italy under a white cross in a field she would never in her life afford to see. Now, here's the thing I need you to understand about the note. Because the whole story turns on it, and I want it clean in your mind. When Tom died, the payments fell behind. Of course they did. A dead man doesn't harvest. The bank, Prairie State's Farm and Loan, out of the county seat, they came to her that first hard winter, all sympathy and paper. And they rolled her back payments into some war bond drive. Told her it was patriotic. Told her it eased her terms. She signed without reading. You sign anything when a man's just died. You sign because a pen is lighter than a shovel, and you have already carried too much that week. She didn't understand what she'd signed. Most folks wouldn't. What it meant was that her debt got bundled up with 100 others and sold, the way a bank sells its paper when it wants cash today instead of dollars stretched across 10 years. Her note went into the pile, and that pile went out into the world with her name and her land written on it. And she thought no more about it, because a woman with a farm to run and a boy to raise does not lie awake wondering who, precisely, owns the mortgage. The bank owns the mortgage. That's all anybody thinks. The bank. But paper travels. Remember that. Paper travels, and it can end up in a stranger's coat pocket, riding a bus into a town that stranger has never seen. The trouble came to a head on a Tuesday in October. I'll tell it to you the way it happened. The bus from Wichita stopped once a day at the corner of the feed store, where the highway bent through Halloran. It let off the mail, mostly a drummer now and then, selling liniment or Bibles. That Tuesday, it let off a man nobody knew. He came down the steps slow. Not hurt exactly, but careful, the way a man moves when his body has learned that the ground is not always where it looks. He wore a wool coat gone thin at the elbows and army boots polished past their years. Salt and pepper hair cut close, a dark mustache, brown eyes that did not hurry. He was maybe 32 and looked 40, which is what the war did to the ones it sent back. He carried a duffel on one shoulder. And in his breast pocket, folded twice, he carried two things. One was a paper with a woman's name on it. The other, he did not show anybody. His name was Elias Vance. He'd been a sergeant, late in the war. He was quiet and slow to speak, and when he did speak, the words came out weighed, like a man counting change he can't afford to drop. He set his duffel down on the boardwalk, and he asked the feed store clerk one question. Which way to the Marsh place? The clerk looked him over. Strangers were a small event in Halloran. The Marsh quarters north 2 miles. Widow Marsh runs it. What's your business, if you don't mind? Elias Vance did mind, a little. But he answered anyway, because a lie right at the start would poison everything after, and he had already decided he would not lie any more than the truth forced him to. I hold a note on it, he said. Come to collect. Now understand, the clerk heard those words the way you'd hear them. The way the whole town would come to hear them. Another buzzard. Another man in a coat with a paper, come to pick the widow's bones. And that reputation walked ahead of Elias Vance up the north road before his boots ever got there. That's the cruelty of a small town. It decides who you are before you've said your second sentence. But here is what the clerk did not know, and what the town did not know, and what Della herself would not know for a long and terrible while. Elias Vance had not stumbled onto that paper. He had not bought it by accident in some bundle of bonds. He had hunted it. He had spent months tracking one woman's mortgage across 3 banks and a state line. And he had bought his way into the bond issue for one reason only, to hold that exact note in his own 2 hands. Because he had made a promise to a dying man. But we'll come to that. We'll come to it when it costs the most. For now, just hold on to this. Nothing Elias Vance did in Halloran, Kansas was an accident, not one thing. He walked the 2 miles north. He came to a gate that hung crooked, and, this is a small thing. But watch it. He lifted the gate as he swung it. The way a man does who's fixed 100 gates, and it did not scrape. He didn't know to lift it. He just knew a broken hinge when he felt one. And his hands lifted without being told. He shut it soft behind him. Della was in the yard when he came up the lane. She had a hen upside down in one hand and a hatchet in the other, and she was not in a mood to be gentled. She saw the coat first. Then the boots. Then the way he carried himself, and something in her went cold, because she had learned that men who walked onto her land walking like that were selling something or taking something, and either way it cost her. "That's far enough," she said. He stopped. He set his duffel down in the dust. He took off his hat, which not many did anymore, and he said, "Mrs. Marsh, do I know you?" "No, ma'am. You knew a man I served with." He paused there. He had a whole speech he'd meant to give, and he found, standing in her yard with the hen squawking and the boy peering out from behind the pump, that the speech had gone to ash in his mouth. So he did the honest thing and the wrong thing both. He reached into his breast pocket and drew out the folded paper. And he held it up so she could see her own name inked across the top. "I hold your note," he said, "the one the bank sold off. $960. The county's got a sale set on this ground 47 days out." He turned the paper so she could read the figure. "I came to look you in the eye before that day came." Seemed only right. For a moment the whole yard was still. Even the hen went quiet. Then Della Marsh laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who has run out of soft feelings and has only the hard ones left. "You came a long way to tell me what I already know, mister. There's a copy of that same paper nailed to my gate. You want to look me in the eye? Look, I'm not going to fall down. I've had my telegram already. There's nothing left you can send me that's worse than the one I got." Elias Vance looked at her. And whatever he saw, the leather hands, the empty chair he couldn't see but somehow felt, the boy behind the pump with his father's ears, it did something to his face. Not pity. She'd have thrown him off the place for pity. Something graver than that. Recognition, maybe, like he'd found the thing he came to find, and it was worse than he'd let himself imagine. "I'll not sleep in your house," he said. "Wouldn't ask it. But I'd take the barn, if you'll let me, and I'd work while I'm here. Your fences want mending. That windmill's not turning right, I can hear the bearing from the road. I won't ask a cent. Call it earning my straw." "Why?" Della said. And it was a real question, sharp as the hatchet. A man doesn't hold a note on a place and then offer to fix its fences for free. What's your game? He didn't answer that. He couldn't answer it, not truly, not yet. So he answered a smaller question instead. "Because the fences want mending," he said, "and I know how, and I've got nowhere I need to be." Which was true. And which was not the truth. And Della, who could smell pity at 40 yards, could not smell this, because this was not pity, and she had no name for the thing it actually was. She let him have the barn, not from softness, from arithmetic. A crooked windmill meant her stock would want water inside the week, and she could not climb that tower and mend a bearing and cut wheat and raise a boy all at once. No matter how hard she'd told herself she could. So she let the stranger have the straw. And she told herself it changed nothing, and she went in and set 3 plates, and filled 2, and did not offer the man in the barn a supper, and lay awake half the night wondering what a stranger wanted with her fences. Now while Elias Vance was making a bed of her barn straw, another man was making plans in town. I told you about him. Harlan Cruz. Cruz was a speculator. That's a polite word. What he did was ride the county courthouse like a farmer rides a good horse. He read the tax rolls the way other men read scripture. He knew which farms were behind, which widows were failing, which soldiers weren't coming home. And when a place got weak enough, Cruz would be there at the courthouse steps with cash in his hand, buying quarter sections for pennies on the dollar and selling them on for dollars on the penny. He wore a good hat and a gold watch chain, and he smiled a great deal, and he had buried more farm families than the influenza. He'd had his eye on the Marsh quarter for a year. Good ground, well water, a rail spur 4 miles off, and a widow he figured would break like kindling the first hard freeze. He'd made his move gentle at first, the way he always did. He drove out in his automobile, one of the few in the county, 2 days after Elias arrived. He found Della at the well, and he did not get out of the car, which told you what he thought of her. He leaned an elbow on the window and he smiled his buried 100 families smile. "Mrs. Marsh, you're looking tired, if you'll forgive me saying." "Then don't say it." He laughed like she'd been charming. "I'll come to it then, that note on your place. I know how these things go. The courthouse will take this ground come the sale and give you nothing for it. Nothing. You'll walk off with a suitcase. Now I'm not the courthouse. I'll give you $700 cash in your hand this week for the whole quarter. That's real money, ma'am. That's a fresh start somewhere a woman doesn't have to break her back. $700 before the county takes it for less. $700. For a farm her husband died owning. For the ground that had her son's name in its future." Della looked at that gold watch chain and that smiling face, and she felt the old cold rage come up in her. And she kept her voice level because a woman who raises her voice has already lost. "My son's name is on this land, Mr. Cruz, not in the deed yet. In the ground, every stone he'll ever throw and every furrow he'll ever plow. You're offering me $700 for my boy's whole life." She stepped back from the car. "Drive careful on the lane. That gate wants lifting." Cruz's smile thinned, just a little. He wasn't used to being turned from a bargain. But he was a patient man, the way a spider is patient. "The offer stands a while," he said. "But it won't stand forever, and the sale won't wait at all. You'll come round, Mrs. Marsh. A widow always comes round." And he backed his automobile down the lane and did not lift the gate. And it scraped a long, ugly groan across the dirt, and Della watched him go with her jaw set hard enough to ache. From the barn, Elias Vance watched too. He'd heard every word. $700. He knew, better than Della did, exactly what her land was worth and exactly how far under the water she was. And he knew something else, something that hadn't yet surfaced, something that was going to make everything harder before it made anything better. But he kept his peace. He went back to the windmill bearing. He worked the truth the way he worked the machine, slow and quiet and out of sight. The windmill was the first proof. I'll tell it to you, because it matters more than it looks. Her stock was going thirsty. The mill hadn't pumped clean in weeks, the bearing at the head was scored, and the sucker rod down the well shaft had come loose, so the blades would turn all day in a good wind and bring up nothing but a trickle and a groan. Della had climbed that 40-foot tower twice herself and gotten nowhere, because it's a two-man job and she had one pair of hands. She'd been hauling water up from the creek by bucket, a quarter-mile each way, to keep the cattle and the mule alive. Her shoulders had knots in them the size of walnuts from it. Elias climbed the tower the first morning without being asked. He didn't announce it. She looked up from the henhouse, and there he was, 40 feet in the air, straddling the platform under the fantail with a wrench in his teeth, working the bearing free. He was up there most of the day. Came down at noon only to work the sucker rod loose from below, then back up. He didn't call for help, and he didn't need to, mostly, but there came a moment, the new rod set, the bearing packed, the whole head ready to lower back into its seat, where it was truly a two-man job or nothing. He called down, quiet as he did everything. "Mrs. Marsh, I need a hand on the rod for 1 minute. Just one." She could have refused. She thought about it. Pride is a strange fuel. It'll let you haul water a quarter mile by bucket rather than hold a rod for 60 seconds beside a man you don't trust. But the stock was thirsty, and the arithmetic won again, and she climbed the tower and put her leathered hands on the rod beside his. And together they lowered the head home and seated it true. And the wind caught the fantail, and the blades came around, and the pump rod started to stroke, up and down, up and down, and clean cold water came gushing up out of the pipe and into the stock tank for the first time in a month. Della stood there on the platform, 40 feet up, watching that water run. And something moved in her that she did not want moving, because she had not been able to do this alone. She had tried and failed and hauled buckets until her shoulders knotted, and this quiet stranger had come and put his hands beside hers for 1 minute, and the water ran. She hated how much it eased her. She hated the ease more than she'd have hated the failure. Because failure she understood. This she did not. "Thank you," she made herself say. 2 hard words. "It wanted 2, Elias said simply. Like it was nothing. Like the whole world wasn't in it. Most things do. And he climbed down and went to mend a fence, and left her standing up there alone with the running water and the feeling she couldn't name. That was the well. Now let me bring you to the church steps. Because that's where the town did its worst. It was the following Sunday. Not that Della was much for church anymore, she and God had a cool understanding since Italy, but the mercantile stayed shut on the Sabbath, and Sunday after service was when the county did its trading and its gossiping, out front of the white clapboard church where everybody gathered. Della came to trade eggs and to buy a sack of flour, and she brought Webb in his one clean shirt, and she held her head up because holding her head up was the only wealth she had left. Harlan Cruz was there. Of course he was. And he had an audience, which was what Cruz loved best. Half the men of Halloran stood around the steps in their Sunday coats, and Cruz raised his voice so it would carry. And he came at her in front of all of them. "Mrs. Marsh, there she is. I was just telling these good men about your predicament." He said the word like it tasted sweet. "You know she's fighting a lost cause out there? Alone on that quarter with a note past due and a sale on the books. I've offered her a fair price, generous, some say, and she's turned it down flat. Now I ask you," he turned to the crowd, spreading his hands, "a widow's got no business fighting a plow and a mortgage both. Am I wrong? It's not pride that keeps a roof up, it's money, and she's out of it." The men shifted and looked at their boots. Some of them, I'll say for them, were ashamed. But not one spoke up. That's the way of it. A bully counts on the silence, and the silence is always there for him. And then Cruz played his card. He had a way of knowing things, the courthouse fed him, and he knew a thing Della herself had half forgotten. "And that's not the whole of it, friends," he said. "There's a lien on that place besides the note. $214 in back taxes, held by Prairie State's Farm and Loan, sitting behind the mortgage like a second mouth to feed. Even if some fool paid the note, the taxes take her anyhow. It's arithmetic. Mrs. Marsh, it was always just arithmetic." $214. Della hadn't known the figure. She'd known there were taxes, everyone has taxes, but she hadn't known it had been set down and held against her like a knife behind a knife. And to hear it announced, the exact sum, on the church steps, in front of every man who'd ever tipped his hat to her, that was the cruelty Cruz had come for. He wanted her to break in public. He wanted the county to watch the widow fold, so that when he took her land it would look like mercy. Della Marsh did not fold. She stood in her clean apron with her boy's hand in hers, and she looked Harlan Cruz full in the face, and she said, "You've done your sums out loud, Mr. Cruz. I'll do mine at home, quiet, the way decent people do. Webb, come on. We've flour to buy." And she turned and walked into the mercantile with her back straight as a fence post, and she did not cry, not there, not where they could see. And I'll tell you who else was on those church steps. Elias Vance. Standing at the back of the crowd in his thin wool coat, with her torn note, with her note still whole in his breast pocket, right then, that morning. He heard Cruz name the tax lien. He heard the whole town brand her a lost cause. And he said nothing, not a word. Because he had not yet decided how to do the thing he'd come to do. And a man who speaks before he's decided only makes noise. So the town looked at the quiet stranger who held the widow's note and stood silent while she was shamed. And the town made up its mind about him too. Another buzzard. Circling. But that night, everything changed. That night is the night the title turns on. A storm was building in the west. You could smell it. That green copper smell that comes before Kansas weather turns mean. The wind had come up wrong, and the windmill, newly mended, was pumping hard, and Della was out at the tower base in the dark with a lantern, adjusting the furl so the mill wouldn't tear itself apart when the gale hit. Working alone. Always alone. The lantern light throwing her shadow huge against the barn. Elias watched her from the barn door, watched her fight the wind for the sake of stock that would be sold out from under her in a month anyway. Watched a woman shamed on the church steps that morning come home and, without a word of complaint, climb back into the work, because the work was all she had. And something in him, the thing he'd carried across an ocean and up a North Kansas road, that thing broke loose. He waited until she'd furled the mill and come in, wind-whipped and grim, to bank the fire. He knocked on her own door, which he'd never done. She opened it with the poker still in her hand. "It's late," she said. "I know it. This won't keep till morning." He came in only as far as the threshold. He would not presume further. And he took the folded paper out of his breast pocket, her note, $960, her name and her land inked across the top, and he laid it flat on the kitchen table in the lantern light where she could see it plain. Then he took it up in his two hands, and he tore it across. Della made a sound, half a word, cut off. You don't tear a note. A note is law. A note is the thing that owns you. She'd have as soon expected him to tear up the sky. He tore it again, and again, into quarters, and he set the pieces down on the table between them, and he looked at her with those grave brown eyes. And he said the thing I've been waiting to tell you. This paper says you're $800 in my debt. He'd already forgiven the $160 in his heart. To him it was $800 of real money he was setting fire to. And he named it low on purpose, like it was smaller than it was. I served with men who paid worse than any bank ever charged. Far as I'm concerned, this note owes you a husband it can't return, so we're square. It's torn. It's gone. There's no man holds paper on this land tonight. The kitchen was dead silent but for the wind. Della looked at the 4 pieces of paper on her table. $960, in pieces. 47 days of dread, in pieces. And she did not feel saved. That's the thing about a woman built like Della Marsh. She looked at that torn note and the first thing that rose in her was not gratitude. It was suspicion. It was the old cold question. Why? Why would a stranger tear up $960 for a woman he'd known a week? There was only one answer she had a box for, and the answer was pity. He felt sorry for the widow. He'd heard crews on the church steps, and he'd come home and thrown her a bone the way you'd throw a bone to a dog you felt bad for. And Della Marsh would rather lose the farm standing up than take a bone thrown down in pity. "I don't want your charity," she said. Her voice shook, but only a little. "Tear up 1,000 papers. I never asked you to. I'll not be some poor widow you save so you can feel like a big man about it." "It's not charity," Elias said. And there was steel under the quiet now. "I've got reasons that are mine to keep. But I'll tell you what I want. Plain, and you can say no to it. I want to stay and work this land through the sale. No wages. Not a cent. I want to see this ground come out clear, the note gone, and that tax lien with it, the whole $214 of it, before I move on. That's all. You can call me a fool, but you can't stop a man from mending your fences for free, and you can't stop him from cutting your wheat, and this coming month you're going to need every hand this county's got, whether you'll say it or not." There it was. And Della, cornered by her own pride, found the only door pride would let her walk through. She would not take him as a rescuer. She would not take his charity. but she could take him as a hired hand, a thing beneath her, a thing she was doing him no favors by allowing, and pride could live with that. "Then you're hired," she said. "Not saved, not thanked. Hired. You work, you eat at my table with my son, and that's your wage. Dinner and nothing more. The first day you look at me like I'm something to be pitied, you're down the road." "Are we clear?" "Clear," Elias said. And that was the bargain. A torn note on the table, a storm coming down, and a widow who'd just been rescued swearing up and down she hadn't been. He gathered the 4 pieces of the note, didn't throw them out, I want you to notice, folded them into his pocket, kept them, and he went back out to the barn in the first fat drops of rain. And Della stood in her kitchen a long while, looking at the empty table where the paper had been. And she could not have told you, if you'd asked, whether the wet on her face was the storm blown in through the door or something she'd have died before admitting. The weeks after that were the making of them, though neither would have called it that. He fixed the gate latch. That was the second small thing, and it undid something in her she'd kept braced. The crooked gate that everyone in the county knew to lift, the hinge Tom meant to fix the week he shipped out. Della came back from the henhouse one gray morning and swung it out of habit, bracing for the scrape and the lift. And it swung true. Silent, level, mended, he'd reset the hinge and rehung the whole gate while she wasn't looking and said not one word about it. And she stood there swinging it back and forth like a fool, that little clean motion, and her throat closed up. Because Tom had meant to fix that gate, and Tom never had, and now it was fixed. And the man who fixed it would never know what it cost her to watch it swing. He learned how she took her coffee. Black, with a spoon of sorghum stirred in. A poor woman's sweetness from the days before the war when sugar was dear. He never asked. He just watched, once, and after that her cup came to the table already right. And she never said thank you for it, and he never waited to be thanked. And there was the evening Webb fell asleep on the porch steps waiting to see the first star, the way little boys do. And Della found him there already gone under, and before she could gather him up she saw that Elias had come across the yard quiet and laid his own thin wool coat over the sleeping boy and stepped back into the dark before either of them could make it mean anything. That was his way. Approach, and give, and retreat, before the giving could be seen for what it was. A man hiding his own heart the way another man might hide a wound. Della watched all of it, and told herself none of it moved her. Told herself he was a hired hand paid in dinner. Told herself the warmth in her chest was just the fire drawing well. Then, one afternoon in late October, she came in from the field and stopped dead on her own porch, because the whole western sky had gone the color of a bruise. Green-black, boiling, low, and the air had that copper taste, and the birds had all gone quiet at once the way they do, and every farmer's child in Kansas knows that silence in their bones. Hail. A hailstorm, close and coming fast, the kind that can flatten a wheat crop to straw in 10 minutes and take a whole year's living with it. And her wheat stood ripe and uncut in the North 40, every kernel of it the difference between $214 paid and her son's name gone off the land forever. She heard Elias come out of the barn behind her. She turned. And she saw that he'd seen it too, and that he knew exactly what it meant, and that the same thought was already in both their heads before either of them said a word. We have to bring it in. Now, tonight. Before the sky comes down. They didn't talk about it. There wasn't time to talk about it. Della ran for the scythe hanging in the barn. Elias took the second one down off the wall before she reached it, already stripping his coat. Webb came out onto the porch in his sock feet, and she pointed him at the wagon and said one word, "Gather," and the boy knew. He'd been raised on this ground. He knew what the sky meant same as she did. They went into the North 40 in the last copper light. The wheat stood up gold and ripe and heavy-headed, 40 acres of it, and every stalk was a coin, and the sky was coming to take it all. Elias moved into the standing grain and swung. She had never seen a man cut like that. Long, even strokes, no wasted motion, the blade laying the stalks down in a clean windrow behind him. He'd cut before. He'd cut a lot. Somewhere, some other year of his life he never spoke about. She fell in beside him and matched her stroke to his, and the two blades went whist, whist, whist in the dark. And Webb came behind on his knees, gathering the fallen wheat into sheaves, his small arms full of it, his father's ears pink in the cold. The light went. The stars didn't come. That green-black wall just kept rolling toward them, and under it the air went colder and colder, and once they heard the first far-off rattle of hail on somebody else's roof, 2 miles north, the Hendricks place maybe, and Della's heart went to water. But Elias didn't stop swinging. So she didn't stop either. They cut by feel. By the sound of the blade finding the stalk. Della's shoulders caught fire, and then went numb, and then stopped being hers at all, just two arms swinging a scythe in the dark because the alternative was her son's name coming off the land forever. And then, she never knew the hour, Elias straightened up and stood still, and she stopped too, and she heard it. Quiet. The field had gone quiet. There was no more standing wheat to cut. They'd laid the whole North 40 down, 40 acres by hand in the black of night, and it was in the windrow and half of it in the wagon, and above them the bruise-colored sky gave one long groan of thunder and let go. The hail came down. But it came down on stubble. On bare cut ground. On nothing it could hurt anymore. They ran the wagon into the barn with the sheaves and stood in the doorway, all three of them, soaked and shaking, and watched the ice come down white in the dark and bounce in the yard. Webb laughed first. Then Della. Then, and this was the thing she'd remember, then Elias laughed too. A low, rusty sound like a hinge that hadn't turned in years, like a man surprised to find he still had it in him. She looked at him laughing in the barn door with hail roaring on the roof, and she thought, God help me. And she didn't finish the thought, because she was afraid of where it ended. That was the first frost, that same week. It came silver on the fence wire in the mornings, and something in Della went with it, some hard thing she'd carried since the telegram. Some part of her began, quiet as frost, to thaw. The days shortened. They worked the ledger by lamplight now, the two of them at the kitchen table, Webb asleep in the next room. She'd laid the whole sorry mess of it out for him. The note, the back taxes, the lien the bank held behind everything. And Elias would sit with his coffee, black with a spoon of sorghum stirred in the way he'd learned to take it, because that was the only way she made it, and he'd run his thumb down the columns and find the money she couldn't find. Haul it to the rail spur, he told her. 4 miles east, don't take it to Cruz's elevator. He'll dock you a nickel a bushel for the pleasure of robbing you. She did. And it made the difference. And one night, going over the figures, she reached for the tax notice at the same moment he did, and their hands touched on the paper, and neither one pulled back as fast as they should have. Elias, she said. It was the first time. She'd called him Vance, or nothing at all, for 6 weeks. And now she'd said his given name in her own kitchen. And it hung there in the lamplight between them, and they both heard it for what it was. He set his cup down very careful. Yes, he said. Nothing more. But his ears had gone the color of Webb's. They were close then, that's the plain truth of it. Two people worn down to the true grain of themselves, working the same ground, and it happened the way it happens on a farm, not in a rush. But in the doing. In the passing of a tool. In the warm plate she started keeping back for him without a word. In the gate latch he mended that had hung crooked since Tom went to the war, mended without being asked, so that the first morning she pushed it and it swung true and clicked shut clean, she stood there in the yard a long minute with her hand on the wood and couldn't have told you why her eyes stung. But the bank wasn't done. And neither was Cruz. The letter came from Prairie State's Farm and Loan on a Tuesday. They'd moved the sale up. Pushed it right to the harvest's edge, close enough that she'd have to sell green or sell nothing. Cruz's hand was all over it. You could smell him on the paper. The speculator whispering in the bank's ear, tightening the screw, trying to shake her loose before the crop could pay. And Cruz came himself, the next afternoon, up her lane in his good car with his hat on his knee. He found her at the well. He didn't get out. He just rolled the window down and rested his arm on the door and looked at the farm the way a man looks at a thing he's already decided he owns. $900, Mrs. Marsh, he said. Cash money. Today, that's $200 over what I offered in the spring. And it's $200 more than the courthouse will bring you when they sell it out from under you next week. He smiled. A widow's got no business fighting a plow and a mortgage both. I've said it before. Della set the bucket down on the well lip. She wiped her hands on her apron. Slow. You have, she said. You said it on the church steps, in front of half the town, the day you told the whole county what I owed. I remember it real well. Then you know I'm right. I know you counted wrong. She looked at him steady, green eyes and that dimpled, resolute set to her mouth. This ground is my son's name, Mr. Cruz. It's the only thing his father left him, besides a folded telegram. I'll work it or I'll lose it standing up, but I will not hand it to you across a car door for $900 while I've still got 2 good hands and a crop in the field. His smile went thin. You'll regret that. I've regretted worse, she said, and picked up her bucket, and walked back to the house, and did not once look behind her. That night she asked him. Not the bank, not the note. She asked Elias, plain, across the table. Stay through harvest, she said. I'm not asking you to save me. I've had about all the saving I can stomach from men who feel they owe me something. I'm asking because it's 2 people's work and I've only got 1 person. That's all it is. Will you stay? And he said yes. And she believed then that she understood the whole shape of what was between them. She didn't. She didn't understand any of it. The trouble came the way trouble comes on a farm, all at once, in the worst week, at night. The good milk cow foundered, got into the green wheat somehow and swelled up sick and groaning in the stall. And the same night, the very same night, Webb woke burning. Fever up so fast it frightened her, his skin dry and hot, his eyes glassy, and him asking for his father in the dark the way a sick child will ask for the parent that isn't there. Della didn't sleep, neither did Elias. He worked the cow, walked her, dosed her, kept her on her feet through the worst of the bloat till the danger passed toward morning. And Della sat with the boy and cooled his forehead and sang the little that she could remember of what to sing. Sometime in the dead middle of the night Elias came in from the barn smelling of the sick animal. And he crossed the kitchen and put his own hand flat on Webb's forehead beside hers, just to feel the fever for himself. And his hand was warm and steady, and it lay over the backs of her fingers for a moment before he took it away. He'll turn by dawn, Elias said. Fevers this fast break just as fast. I've seen it in men, I've seen it in boys. And Webb did turn by dawn. The fever broke and left him wet and weak and hungry, and the cow lived and the sun came up on the 2 of them, Della and Elias, gray-faced at the kitchen table, too tired to say a word, and that was maybe the closest they ever were. 2 people who'd carried the same load through the same long dark and come out the other side with the boy alive. The wheat still had to come in. 40 acres cut was one thing. Threshed and hauled and sold before a sale date the bank had moved up on purpose, that was more than 2 hands could do, even 4, even racing. And that was when the neighbors came. She never asked them. She'd never have asked them. Pride like hers doesn't ask. But Elias had gone to town quiet one afternoon, and he'd said a few words in the right ears. And on a cold, bright morning at the tail of harvest the wagons started up her lane. The Hendricks family. The Olafsons. Old Pruitt, who hadn't spoken 20 words to a living soul since he lost his own boy in the last war. Old Pruitt came and brought his team and set to work without a word, same as always. 30 people before the day was out. 30, neighbors she'd nodded to at church and traded eggs with and never once let see the inside of her trouble. They brought their teams and their strongbacks and their dinner in baskets, and the women filled her kitchen, and the men filled her field, and the wheat that had stood between her and ruin came in that day in a thunder of hooves and laughter and dust. A harvest bee, the oldest thing on the plains. The whole scorned, whispering, church-step county turning out to stand with the widow crews had shamed. And in the middle of all of it, while the men rested at noon and ate off her tables in the yard, Webb went through the pockets of Elias's coat where it hung on the wagon. A boy will do that, hunting a peppermint, hunting anything. And his small hand closed on something round and heavy and cool. He pulled it out into the sunlight. A watch. A man's watch, brass, worn to a soft gold shine, on a fob rubbed thin by a thumb over long years. And Webb went very still, because he knew it. He was 8 years old, and he barely remembered his father's face, but he knew this. He'd sat on his father's knee and listened to it tick. "Mama," he said. And his voice was strange enough that the yard went quiet. "Mama, this is Papa's watch." Della came across the grass and took it from his hand. She turned it over. And there on the back, in the worn engraving she'd read 100 times before Tom carried it off to the war, was her husband's name. Tom's watch. Tom's brass railroad watch that had gone with him to Italy and never come home. In Elias Vance's coat pocket. The whole harvest bee stood still around them. Della lifted her eyes to Elias, and every warm thing that had grown in her that autumn turned to ice in one breath. "How," she said. "Do you have my husband's watch?" He didn't run from it. She'd give him that. Always. He set down his cup and he stood up and he faced her in front of 30 people with his hat in his hand. "Because I was there when he died," Elias said. The words fell into the quiet like stones into a well. "I was his sergeant," he said. "Corporal Tom Marsh. Spring of 44. In Italy. In the rain. We got caught crossing a low place, and the water was coming up and the fire was coming down, and I went under in a flooded ditch with a pack full of ammunition dragging me down. And I was done. I was finished. Mrs. Marsh and your husband came back for me. He came back into that water when every sane man was going the other way, and he got 2 hands in my collar and he hauled me up out of it." Elias's voice didn't shake, but it cost him not to. And a shell came in while he was doing it. And it took him and not me. He died getting me out. His last minute of living he spent it saving a man he'd known 8 months. Della's hand had gone white around the watch. "He gave me this before they carried him off," Elias said. "Pressed it into my hand. Couldn't hardly talk. But what he got out was, 'See them right.' His wife and his boy, 'See them right.' That was all. That was the whole of it." He looked at her, and there was nothing hidden in his face now, nothing held back, only the plain, terrible truth of it. "So I did. When I mustered out, I didn't stumble onto your note, ma'am. I went looking for it. I found which bank held your paper and which bond issue they'd bundled it into, and I bought my way into it on purpose so that I'd be the one holding it. I came here to tear it up. I've meant to see you right since a wet ditch in Italy, and I've lied to you about the reason every single day I've stood on your land. The wind moved the cut wheat. Nobody in that whole gathered county said a word. And Della heard none of the love in it. She heard only the debt. So it was pity, she said. Her voice was very quiet and very level, and it was the worst thing he ever heard. All of it. The gate. The coffee. The coat over my son. The nights you sat up with me. It was a bill you were paying to a dead man. She pressed the watch back into his hand hard enough to hurt. I told you. The first night I told you, I've had all the saving I can stomach from men who owe me something. And you owed me the most of anyone alive. You owed me my husband. Della, take the watch, she said. Take your coat. And get off my son's land. He went. He didn't argue and he didn't plead, because a man like that doesn't. He gathered his things in the failing light while the neighbors looked at their boots, and he walked down the lane and out the gate that swung true because he'd mended it, and Della stood in her kitchen with her back to the window so she wouldn't have to watch him go. But he'd left two things on the table. The watch, and beside it, two torn halves of paper. The mortgage note, the one he'd ripped across that first storm night that she'd thought was long burned. He'd kept it. Kept the two halves of it all this time in his breast pocket next to her husband's watch. Cruz had it all over town by the next morning. She heard it from the Olafson girl at the mercantile, how the widow Marsh had kept a man in her barn all fall, a stranger with no claim, and how it had come out ugly at the harvest bee. The widow's kept man, Cruz was calling him, saying it in the feed store, saying it on the church steps where he said everything. Bought his way onto her farm. The whole thing dressed up filthy and passed hand to hand, and the sale 2 days off, and Della $214 short even with the whole crop sold, because the bank's lien stood behind everything and the crop money didn't quite reach. 2 days off, $214 short. And the one man who might have known how to close the gap gone down the lane for good. That night she couldn't sleep, and she came down to the dark kitchen, and she picked up the watch because she couldn't help it. Tom's watch. She turned it in her hands the way you turn any last thing a dead man touched. And her thumb found a catch on the case she'd never known was there. A little hinged lip, worn smooth, and it gave. And a second cover swung open inside the first. There was a folded paper hidden in it. Old, soft, folded small. Pencil, gone gray with handling. She sat straight down on the kitchen floor in her nightdress and read it by the moon. It was Tom's hand. Tom's own crooked pencil, a letter he'd started and never sent, written some rainy night in Italy in the spring of '44, close as she could tell to the end. Della, it said. If you're reading this, I likely didn't make it home, and I'm sorry for it. Sorrier than a pencil can say. I want to tell you about my sergeant. Vance, he's the steadiest man I ever knew, and I've trusted him with my life more nights than I can count, and he'd not thank me for saying so. Here's what I need you to hear. You're the proudest woman God ever made, and I love you for it. But pride won't get the wheat in, and pride won't raise our boy. If I don't come home, don't be too proud to let a good man help you. Don't shut the door on somebody who comes to your gate meaning good, just because it hurts your pride to need him. That's my last worry, that you'll do that. Promise me you won't. Love a good man if one comes, Della. It's what I want. It's the only thing I want, if I can't be him myself. She sat on the cold floor a long time. The ghost that had stood in that empty chair for a year and a half, that had kept her armored, kept her hard, kept her turning away every hand that reached for her, that ghost let go of her in the dark. Not gone. Never gone. But loosened, set her free with his own pencil, in words written before he died, to bless the very thing her pride had just thrown down the lane. She was still on the floor when the knock came, gray dawn, and it was the Pruitt boy, breathless, sent by his father. Mrs. Marsh, ma'am, he didn't leave, the boy said. Vance, he never got on the bus. My pa saw him. He's been down at the courthouse since yesterday morning. Been in and out of the bank and the assessors both. Pa says you ought to come to the sale. The sale. She'd meant not to go. She'd meant to lose it standing up. At home, with the door shut, the way you lose anything you love. But she took Webb's hand and she put on Tom's coat over her dress because it was cold. And she folded the two torn halves of the note into her pocket, and she walked the 2 miles into Halloran to stand on the courthouse steps and watch them sell her son's inheritance. The same crowd was there. That was the thing that near broke her, it was the very same crowd. The men who'd stood on those steps in the spring and heard Cruz name her debt to the county, they were all there again. Come to watch how it ended, the way people do. And Cruz stood at the front with a fold of cash money in his fist and his hat pushed back, waiting to buy the Marsh quarter for whatever the courthouse would let it go for. The auctioneer came out with his papers. He read the description of the land in that flat courthouse drone, the quarter section, 2 miles north of town, the improvements, the whole of it. And he said, "Sale is ordered to satisfy the lien held by Prairie States Farm and Loan in the amount of $214, together with, that lien's been paid." The whole crowd turned. Elias Vance came up the courthouse steps with a fold of papers in his hand, salt and pepper and steady, and he wasn't looking at Cruz and he wasn't looking at the auctioneer. He was looking at Della, standing at the back with her boy. "Paid in full," Elias said, "yesterday morning. The lien and the note both. Here's the release from the bank, and here's the receipt from the assessor for the $214 in back taxes." He handed the papers up to the auctioneer. "The Marsh quarter is clear. There's nothing here to sell." The auctioneer read it. Read it twice. And then he looked out over the crowd and he said, "The gentleman's papers are in order. The Prairie States lien is satisfied and released. Back taxes paid in full." He set his gavel down. "There'll be no sale today. This property's free and clear in the name of," he checked the paper, "Della Marsh." Cruz's face. Della watched it happen. She watched the cash go slack in his fist and the color climb up out of his collar. "Where'd he get that kind of money?" Cruz said, too loud. "A drifter." "Where'd a drifter get?" "He sold his bonds," the bank clerk said, right up on the steps. Not unkind. Just setting the record straight for the county to hear. Mustering out bonds and his war back pay, the both of it. Cashed out at our window yesterday morning. $900 and better. Near enough his last dime, and he put every cent of it against the widow's debt and kept not $1 of it for himself. Put it all in her name. I filed the papers with my own hand. The whole quiet crowd took that in. The same crowd that had watched her shamed. They stood on those same steps and they watched her set free, and they understood, every one of them, exactly what they were looking at, a man who'd emptied his own pockets to the seams so a widow he'd been sent away from could keep her boy's ground. Cruz put his cash back in his coat. There wasn't anything for him there anymore. He went down the steps through a crowd that opened for him slow and cold, and at the bottom he stopped by Della because he couldn't help himself, and he said, low and dry, "You made a fool bargain, Mrs. Marsh. You'll be back to the plow and the mortgage both by spring, and no man fool enough to buy your paper twice." Della looked at him, and she took the 2 torn halves of the note out of her pocket and held them up so he could see them. "You told me a widow can't fight a plow and a mortgage both," she said. Dry as he was, final as a closing door, "You never once counted on 2 pairs of hands." And she turned her back on Harlan Cruz for the last time, and she walked across the courthouse steps to Elias Vance in front of the whole assembled county. She didn't thank him. She knew better than to thank him. Thank you was for rescue, and she'd sworn off rescue, and anyhow he'd have hated it. She stood in front of him with the torn note in her hand and Webb's fingers in her other hand. And she said the truest thing she knew how to say. "I read Tom's letter," she said. "The one hid in the watch. So I know what he asked me, and I know now what you did, and why. But I'm not standing here because a dead man told me to, any more than you did all you did just to pay him back. That's not what this is. That stopped being what this is somewhere back in a wheat field in the dark." She had to stop and get her breath. Green eyes bright and steady. "I don't need a man to pay my debts, Elias. I paid enough of them myself. What I need, what I've got no shame left about needing, is a man who'll take up the other handle of a 2-man saw and pull his half and mean it. Every day. For good. That's not saving. That's partnering." Her chin came up, that stubborn Marsh chin her son had too. "So I'm not going to ask you to stay because you owe it. I'm asking because I want you here. Will you stay?" And Elias Vance, who'd hidden every gift he ever gave and retreated before it could be seen, who'd carried a dead man's watch and a dead man's charge halfway across a country. Elias looked at her, and for once he didn't retreat. He gave her back her own word. The only answer that could have earned the whole long road there. "Stay," he said. And Webb let go of his mother's hand and ran the 3 steps and hit Elias around the middle hard enough to rock him, and pressed the brass watch up into his hands. "You keep it," the boy said. "Papa'd want you to have it. You brought it home." Elias closed his hand around the watch and around the boy, and he couldn't say anything at all for a moment. And he didn't have to. They were married the next spring. A year on from the sale that never happened, and the spring wheat came up green to the fence line, green as anything in the world, running away toward the 2-mile road under a sky washed clean. The quarter section held. The boy's name held with it. Tom's brass railroad watch hangs on a nail by the kitchen door now, where the morning light comes across it every day and lays a little gold on the wall. Webb winds it. That was the one job he asked for and the one they gave him, to wind his father's watch every morning, and he does it standing on a stool by the door before the light's full up. The gate latch swings true and clicks clean every time, and nobody in that house has to think about why anymore. There's a new sign on the quarter, out by the road where the sheriff's notice used to hang. Elias made it over the winter, planed it smooth, and there are 2 names burned into it now instead of 1. And in the family Bible, pressed flat between the pages the way you press a flower you mean to keep, there's a folded piece of paper. The mortgage note, both its torn halves, taped whole again. They kept it. Not because it's a debt, it hasn't been a debt in a long time. They kept it because it's where the whole thing started, that torn paper, and because some things you hold on to not for what they cost, but for what they turned into. There are debts you can't ever pay back in money. Della learned that on a kitchen floor in the dark with a dead man's letter in her hands. Some debts you can only pay by staying. By taking up the other handle and pulling your half and meaning it, every day, for good. That's the only currency that ever squares them. Tom knew it. He wrote it down in pencil in the rain before he died. Don't be too proud to let a good man help you. She wasn't in the end. And she got her whole life back for it. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, comment your city. I'd like to know how far this story's traveled.